Welcome. We're going to talk about collaborative database decision making in the age of uncertainty. So, how do we use data? Given that we're in uncertain times, and just there's a lot of uncertainty that we have in school. So, how do we use data to make some good decisions around that? So, real quick introductions for those of you that don't know us. So, my name is John Potter. I am one of the ORTIi coaches. This is my 13th year with the project. So we support schools all over the state of Oregon and some beyond, but happy to be here with you. And I'll let Brad introduce himself, although he may have already at the keynote.
My name is Brad Thorud. Currently, I'm the director of Oregon Response Instruction Intervention. I've been with the project 3 years, and prior to this, I was 2 years as a systems implementation coach, and then before that, I was a principal. So it's really great to be here with y'all, and I appreciate y'all very much.
I think even though Brad hasn't been a coach for as long as I have, I think he's probably been involved with the Oregon RTI project as long as I have, as a principal and as a teacher and as a participating in multiple cohorts. So
and coming to this conference for many years and connecting to the work. So I appreciate you too. Yeah, it's good to be here with you as a colleague. Absolutely.
So today's information, I like to start out my presentations just with this kind of precursor for folks. So some stuff you're going to hear today is new. I mean, that's the point of coming to a training, right? Is you want to hear some new stuff, you want to learn some stuff. So hopefully we'll give you some new information to, as Anita Archer would say, stuff your head with background knowledge. So we're going to do that for you today. But some of what you're going to hear today is going to be review. And I say this because we get this a lot at trainings. Folks say, well, I already knew that. Why do you need to say that? I already knew that. And first of all, there's a lot of folks here, so I don't know what your background knowledge is and what some folks don't know. But secondly, if you hear things that you already knew, that's great. Celebrate that. When I go to a training, I want to hear things that I already know, because that tells me, I know something, like I'm on the right track. And one of the best predictors of how well we learn new information is what we already know about that topic. So I want to build on what you already know. So some of this will be review. But also, some information that you hear today may challenge what you currently know. We may say something in a different way. We may say something that you don't agree with. And we are by no means, the foremost experts on, everything around this topic. We're still learning and growing around this as well, as all of you are. But some of the things may be a little bit different than what you've heard before. And so we want to think about, if you attended, for example, Stephanie Stoller's session yesterday, she talked about, how do you take conflicting information, and you take all information together and you make the best possible decision. So just be thinking about that. All right, so today we're going to talk about a few ideas. So we're going to start by touching on, why is it important to use data? And I want to touch on this idea of how we use data to mitigate the biases that we have as decision makers, because we are not these perfect, robotic algorithms that make perfect decisions all the time. So how do we use data to really drive what we're doing and make better decisions? And then we're going to touch on, Brad's going to dive into, how do we start to move from being more intuitive in our decision making, kind of fly by the seat of our pants decision making about kids, to really being deliberate and taking time to make some really good decisions for our kids, because many of the decisions we're making are pretty high stakes for students and their families, and we want to honor that and take time to be able to make really good decisions for our students. All right. So when we think about the decisions that we're making, within a multi-tiered system, we often think about the different tiers of instruction and supports. And there's a lot of decisions that go into, having an effective multi-tiered system. And so we think about, these decisions around at tier 1, we're asking, is our course sufficient? That core reading instruction and supports that we have, who is it working for? Who is it not working for? Because all of our supports work for someone and they don't work for other students. And so the idea is we want to make them more effective for the students that they're not working for. So we want to think about that. At tier 2, we're often thinking about our intervention support. So the idea of, are our interventions working? And this is a concept we're going to come back to in this presentation pretty heavily. Just this idea of, how do we use data to really answer that question around, are our interventions working? Are they effective? And who are they working for and who are they not working for? And then when do we change interventions? When we know an intervention is not effective, what do we change it to? How do we change it? So we're going to have some of those conversations today. And then at tier 3, thinking about the question of, when things aren't working, how do we intensify through a more individualized problem solving process? When do we do that? What does that look like? And then, thinking about when is it time to refer a student for a special ed evaluation. We most certainly don't want to, delay a student by just, going through, jumping through hoops and checking off boxes. But an effective multi-tiered system is designed to really prevent students from needing special education, because we want to provide really effective interventions all along the way for students. But some students will need an IEP and special ed support. So we want to honor that and think about when that decision needs to be made. But again, for this presentation, we're really going to focus mainly on that tier 2 piece around interventions and how do we use decision rules to guide, intervention decision making. So I want to think about why data is important. So why do we use data? Okay. But I think this, if you've read Dan Heath's book, Upstream, came out last year, fantastic book about how do we prevent problems rather than always be reactive in our thinking. I think this quote really encapsulates really well why we use data and why a multi-tiered system is one of our most effective tools to build a system that's going to support our students. And so it's the idea of, we're always trying to chase the perfect solution. This happens a lot in education. We want, what curriculum we use. We want the best curriculum. We want the best assessment. We want the best intervention. Let's just figure out what we need to buy and let's implement. And to some extent, that's really the wrong way to go about things, because it's really kind of we hope for the best when we do that. But what we want to do instead is really get some pretty good solutions in place, but good solutions that are equipped with feedback loops that we can't help but get better over time. Because you could have the best intervention program in the world and it's still not going to work for each and every one of your students. There are a lot of things that we simply can't predict about how our students are going to interact with a lot of really good programs. Life events happen, different things happen to students. So we want to think about how we use data to really evaluate what we're doing and change it to make it better. If we're not using data and collecting it frequently to figure out if what we're doing is working, then we end up drifting over time. And we can't really build a system that's going to meet the needs of all of our students. So a few caveats as we start to talk through this idea of data and why it's important. So first caveat is this idea that all data are not created equal. And so we think about the term data, right? It's everywhere in education. We want to be database decision makers. We want data to drive everything that we're doing. But data is a loose term. It's almost like you see a lot of programs now. I don't think there's a single curriculum out there that's not going to say it's not research-based. Like everything's research-based, apparently. Data is almost the same thing, where it's just a watered down term. And so the analogy I like to use with data is this idea of, think about your head. If I say the word, if I say for lunch after this, I'm gonna go have a salad. Now, what are you thinking of? Like, think in your brain, just like, what does that salad look like? What's in it? And many of you may be thinking of something that looks a little like this, that's a green, healthy salad, lots of veggies, you got some chicken in there, looks like some mango. That's a very nutritious, healthy salad. That's what we think of when we think of salad. But I had the opportunity to spend a few years working out in Iowa in the Midwest. And if you're from the Midwest or live in the Midwest or spend any time out there, the word salad is a loose term. We could say that salad is more inclusive in the Midwest. And so if you're from the Midwest, you may notice something like this is also a salad. Bonus points if anyone knows what this is called. You can go ahead and put it in the chat. But this is also a salad. And I think someone's got it. Yep, Snicker salad, that's right. Snicker salad is delicious. Like, it's fantastic. In my opinion, not a salad. Like, I'm not knocking it. It's a great snack and a great food, but not super nutritious. And so when we think about data, we have high quality data that's very nutritious, or sorry, not very nutritious, very high quality, going to give you good information. And you have low quality data that's not going to give you really good information. Still data, but not really high quality. Just like, these are two different ends of the salad continuum. And so we want to think about the data that we're using. We want to be more high quality, reliable, valid, technically adequate, has been tested with the types of students that we're going to be using with, rather than just saying, oh yeah, we're database decision makers. We use data, but it's really low quality data that isn't going to tell us what we want, or is not necessarily valid and reliable. So I want you to think about that. All right. Caveat 2. So this idea of we often focus a lot on the database decision making, and sometimes we spend a lot less time focused on the database decision implementing. And so what I mean by that is we've all sat at those meetings where we look at data, we talk about kids, we make a plan. It may be a really great plan. And then we go forth, we go implement that plan. And as soon as we walk away from that table, some people forgot what they were supposed to do. Some people got back in the classroom and you got, 4 other kids that are having behavior issues that you're not able to implement that plan. But something goes wrong and we don't actually do what we actually agreed to do. Come back to the table, maybe 8 to 10 weeks, say it didn't work. That was a bad plan. It's like, well, was that a bad plan or we just didn't really implement that plan really well? And so we want to think about, when we think about was a plan good or bad, decision might be good or bad depending on how well you implement it. We've also all sat at those meetings where the plan we put together wasn't very good, but someone goes above and beyond and really, puts in the extra hours to make sure that the student is successful. Was that a good plan or was that just someone, following up and really implementing really well? And so we want to think about, yes, use data, make good decisions, but put more work into making sure that you're actually implementing the plans that you're deciding on. I always think about, planning is one thing. I plan to eat better and exercise more, but the implementation of that isn't always there. And so we want to make sure that we're implementing things really well because that's where it really matters. And then the last caveat to think about is, this is probably the most important one, is that data represent kids, right? Each data point is a student. And so we think about like a graph like this, and this is from just this past winter. So this is data from Amplify looking at screening data, over the past 3 years within the pandemic. What we've seen is, there's a bump up from 2019 to 2020 in the percentage of kids needing intensive levels of supports for reading. And that's gone down a little bit this past year, but not significantly. And so as I look at any one of these graphs, these dark red bars here at each grade level, this past winter, you've got roughly a third, give or take, at each grade level of students that are in need of really intensive supports. And so sometimes we tend to forget the stories behind these graphs. If you work in a school with kids, you know who these kids are, you have faces to put on these graphs. And we want to make sure that we're attentive to this data, because sometimes we tend to write off data and say, well, it's just a number, right? It doesn't tell me, the whole story about these students. And yes, that's absolutely 100% true. I agree with that. At the same time, if we know the research and the evidence behind this data, we know what these data points mean, both for the present of our students, as well as how well they predict the future. A student who's not reading by the end of 3rd grade proficiently, I know what the outcomes are likely for that student unless we do something pretty significant about it. And so I don't want to write off data, just like you wouldn't go to your doctor and you get your blood work back and say, oh, well, it's just a number, right? I'm more than that number. It's like, well, these are important predictors of what could happen. And so we want to make sure that we're attentive to the data, but also understand data is students, data is kids, and how do we really support those kids in a way that's going to help them and their families. So with that being said, I want to do a little activity with y'all, so get you participating in this. So I'm going to put some problems up on the screen here. There's 3 of them. I'm going to give you about 20, 30 seconds for each problem. So what I want you to do is, it's basically just a math problem. So if you don't like math, I'm sorry, but you did come to a presentation on data, so hopefully you at least tolerate math. But what I want you to do is just write down your answer. If you have, a pen and paper, maybe put it in your phone, maybe just keep it in your head. But I want you to write down your answer. Keep it to yourself. Don't put it in the chat for each of these problems. Okay, so you get about 20 to 30 seconds for each one. So I'm gonna go to the first one here. I'm gonna give about 10 more seconds, move on to the next one. All right, so write down your answer if you haven't already. We'll go on to the next one. 10 more seconds. I think I skipped the middle one there, so I'm going to go back to this one. Last one. About 10 more seconds. All right. So now we're gonna do answers. So I'm gonna read through these and kind of share out the answers. So I won't make anyone put their answer in the chat unless someone wants to be brave. So a bat and a ball costs $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? So the answer is 5 cents. So 5 cents. If anyone's brave and wants to put in the chat, did anyone say 10 cents? Either no one said 10 cents or no one's brave enough to say it. So, all right. Yeah, someone did. All right, someone's not brave. Sure, yeah. Someone did, yeah. Okay, yeah, sure. Full disclosure, I think I probably did the first time I took it too, so you're not alone. So yeah, it's 5 cents because the bat costs $1 more than the ball. So if the ball is 5 cents, that means the bat is $1.05. Together, they would be $1.10. If the ball was 10 cents, the bat would be $1.10. Together, they would be $1.20. So they would be more. So yeah, so the answer is 5 cents. So next one, if it takes 5 machines 5 minutes to make 5 widgets, how long would it take 100 machines to make 100 widgets? So anyone want to put your answer in the chat? Be brave. 20, 5, 5, 5, 1. Yeah. So the answer is 5 minutes. So if it takes 5 machines 5 minutes to make 5 widgets, that means in 5 minutes, 1 machine makes 1 widget, 2 machine makes 2 widgets, 3, like 1 widget is making one machine is making 1 widget every 5 minutes. So if the machines and the widgets are the same, like it is 100 and 100, it's always going to be 5 minutes. And last one, if there is in a lake, if there is a patch of lily pads, every day the patch doubles in size. It takes 48 days for the patch to cover the entire lake. How long would it take for the patch to cover half the lake? Anyone want to put your answer in there? 47, 47. Yeah, 47. Someone cheated. They saw it. That's okay. You know, you've got background knowledge. So 47. Yeah. So the answer is 47. Yes. And I'm not going to make anyone put it in there, but if you put 24 in there, that's a common mistake that people make is 24. So, that is not an intelligence test. It is not a test of how smart you are. It's called the cognitive reflection test. And what it is a test of what kind of thinker you are. Are you a more intuitive thinker or more a deliberate thinker? Because they are all designed to give you an answer that pops into your head right away that just screams, this is the answer. But if you rethink it, that answer is incorrect. So the questions are trying to fool you. And so if you got one wrong, at least one wrong, fear not, you're in the majority. 83% of people get at least one wrong. There's very few people that get all those correct. And then if you got them all wrong, you're in decent company. A third of people still get all wrong. Like not everyone gets them even one correct. And then we think about, oh, well, if you're just really smart, you'll get them all right, right? No. Even half of MIT students still get one incorrect. So it's not an intelligence test. You don't have to be super smart to get these right. That's not what this is about. But this is about thinking, are you a more intuitive thinker or are you a more deliberate thinker in how you approach those problems? Because again, something jumps out, your intuition just screams, this is the answer, but you have to really come back and think about those things. And so as we think about the distribution of people using this data above, 33% of people, these people that get all 3 incorrect, are really on this end of just, I'm intuitive. Whatever jumps in my head, That's what we're going with. Versus 17%, that's 100% minus this 83, are the people that get all of them correct. 17% are these deliberate thinkers that go through the motions, just get all of them correct. But most of us are really in the middle here. And what strikes me as I look at this is that there's almost double the people that are this far intuitive than are deliberate. And I think that's a very human thing. We are very intuitive thinkers. Our brain is built in this way to really have quick thinking. And so we're gonna use some quotes from, if you've read the book by Danny Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. Talks about there's a fast brain and a slow brain. And there's some things that we are just designed to think fast on. Think about, when you're driving home from work the same way. I don't want to deliberately have to think about every turn I'm going to make because I want to think about other things. And so that's your fast brain thinking, versus your slow brain is things that you have to think through a little bit more consistently. And so we're all kind of built like that. So another way to look at it is this idea of, and many of you have seen this before, but the question on which line is longer. And if you take out the extraneous information, the arrows there, it's very clear, lines are the same, right? So our intuitions are deceiving, because as you look at that, and I've looked at this hundreds of times, I still want to say that bottom line is longer, right? Because it looks longer. It completely looks longer, but we get distracted by information that isn't important to the question. And so when this question is difficult to answer because we're distracted, what our brain does is it doesn't answer this question. Instead, it comes up with a simpler, easier question that it wants to answer, which is this one. When we look at this, our brain isn't answering which line is longer. Our brain is answering which line looks longer, which can be problematic when we're looking at students and making decisions, because we start to do things like, instead of answering questions around, well, which students need more support, we answer questions that are easier, which students look like they need more support, which we know we have all sorts of biases in terms of not always being the best decision makers to identify those students. Here's a good example of that. So this was one study, it's been replicated a few times, but the idea in this study, they looked at teacher judgment of student reading scores and compared it to their actual DIBEL scores in 1st through 6th grade. And so they asked teachers to judge, is your student in which category of reading are they currently in? Are they scoring above benchmark? Are they below benchmark? Or are they well below benchmark? And what they found was that teachers were often inaccurate in how they judge those. They actually tend to overestimate where their kids are reading at. They're better at saying the high performing kids are high performing, but they're not as good as judging the lower average students. And they were right. They matched the actual reading level about 58% of the time, which is concerning, because that means 42% of the time they were wrong. And that's 4 out of 10 kids that were not, accurate judges of their reading ability. Now, I'm not saying DIBELS is the end all be all. It's just one test. And in several cases, obviously, teachers have more data to go on, both anecdotal and formal data in the classroom. But what's concerning is, DIBELS isn't the end all be all, but I don't think, DIBELS scores are wrong 4 out of 10 times. That's not their technical adequacy. They're going to be mostly right on students. So the other way to think about this, if you just gave me the name of one of your students and I guess randomly, I'd be right 33% of the time, because there's only 3 categories that I could choose. And so teachers are much better than chance. Teachers do a pretty good job of identifying where their students are at. But I don't want to be wrong 4 out of 10 times, because then we start to have some problems with who we're supporting and providing those extra supports to. A big area of concern is where we see this in terms of teacher referral by race. It's the question of who are we referring for special education supports. And so some context to start off this conversation. We know that most students who are referred are typically found eligible for special education supports. This particular study found about 73 to 90% of students that get referred for an IEP end up getting an IEP. It's actually one of the single best predictors of who gets special education is really just whoever we refer. Because we've all had that case where a student gets referred and maybe the data doesn't fit, but the team makes it work, or we just try again later. We have this confirmation bias that if we think a student has a disability, we're going to eventually get them an IEP. And so we want to know, are we referring the right students? And so this study, I'm going to share the data from, what they did was they looked at creating some vignettes. So these are not real kids, but they wrote some basically page-long vignettes of make-believe students. And they had 3 different students. So one student looked like he had a learning disability. One student looked like he had a behavioral emotional disorder. And one student looked like he was talented and gifted. And they had a little bit of data in there. It wasn't very robust. It was more anecdotal information. But the curveball that they threw was each of these vignettes had 3 different versions, right? And so they had a version that looked like a student who was white. They had a version that looked like a student who was African-American, and they had a version that looked like a student who was Latino. Same kid. The only thing they actually changed in each of the vignettes was the name of the student to make it seem like they were of a different race. Because they found just changing the name, previous research had said changing the name actually makes us think of different racial backgrounds for kids. And so the white student was named Jacob, the Black student was named Demetrius, and the Latino student was named Carlos. And so looking at these, again, same kids, there's no difference in the data or anything, just different names. And so if there's no biases that we have, we should be referring these different students at the same rate. But that's not what they found. And so what they found is for learning disability, they were much more likely to refer a white student than they were for Black or Latino students. And if you're in the session with Julie Washington, just prior to this, she talked about this a lot, that a learning disability often is a diagnosis of privilege. This idea that, we simply, unfortunately, have higher expectations for white students and lower expectations for students of color. So when we find that a student is underachieving, that's not as surprising for Latino or Black students. And so we don't tend to refer for students for learning disabilities. For emotional behavior disorders, it was flipped. We were more likely to refer the Black or the Latino student, which is very concerning, because typically what we know about students with those diagnoses or those eligibilities is they're put in more restrictive environments. And so we're more willing to do that for our Black or brown kids, unfortunately. And then for talented and gifted, looked a lot like learning disabled. So we're more likely to put our white kids for talented and gifted. Again, these are the same kids with different names, the exact same kids with different names. And so we have biases, we have all sorts of different biases. And so these are just a small sampling of the biases that we have. And if you use this link down here, you can see dozens more of ways that we are easily fooled. And it's not anything that's wrong with us. It's who we are as humans. We're not these like perfect decision makers that we think. And so we have things like confirmation bias. You're going to remember things that agree with what you already think more likely than things that disagree with you. You see this a lot in social media. You see this in politics. You see this in the news you watch. You like to be confirmed. And when I say you, I mean me, like all of us. We like to be confirmed in what we read. Availability heuristic, we're biased towards information that's more readily available. Whatever you can remember and what you know, you're going to remember more likely. And so we have all these biases, and we need to understand that we have those, because just being confident in your decision, that that this is the right decision, or I'm not being biased, that doesn't mean you've got a higher likelihood of actually being correct or being unbiased. The more confident you are, it just means that you've constructed a coherent story in your mind that really makes sense to you. We do this all the time with kids. Oh, that kid's, I just know that kid's learning disabled because his sister's learning disabled, because, he's got all these other things going on. Like, I've seen enough kids, I know, that story makes sense to you. That doesn't mean the story is true. And we see this especially, this is this idea of the Dunning-Kruger effect. And some of you may have seen this before. But this idea that a little information is dangerous. And so this idea that confidence and competence are not the same thing. And so I like to say, as you have no information on anything, if you don't know anything about a topic, you're typically not confident about it at all. But it goes up pretty quickly. These are the people, and I'm guilty of it too. It's like, oh, I read an article about this. Now I'm an expert. I know everything there is to know about this. But actually, the more you read about something, the more you learn, the curve goes down. You get less confident because things are nuanced. We see this in the science of reading. An article comes out, it's like, oh, I know everything about that. But you need to know about dozens, if not hundreds of studies to really understand it's a complex topic. And so you have this comparison between the person who read an article or two versus the expert who's actually studied this for their whole career. And the thing that stands out about this is that you notice the person that has a little bit of information is typically more confident than the experts that have done this their whole career. And so, excuse me, the idea is the loudest voices are not always the most helpful or knowledgeable. And so we want to understand that and look at the actual information and not just listen to the people that are the most confident. And so it's completely normal to want to simplify complex issues. As I said, it's human. You're going to make intuitive errors. Partially, you think about the evolution of the human brain really hasn't, occurred over that long a time frame. We're not that far away evolutionarily from living in the plains, hunting and gathering. Our brain hasn't evolved that much past that. And so when you're on the plains and you see a large, something coming at you very quickly, back in the hunter-gatherer days, I don't have time to do this deliberate decision making of, well, it could be a wild animal. It also could be, something that's not going to harm me. Like, you're just going to run. Like, your quick brain just gets in and you're going to run. And we've still got that same brain. I mean, it's evolved a little bit, but we want to do things intuitively because our brain cognitively has too much other things going on. And so I'm not suggesting that we're ever going to get rid of those intuitive errors. But what we want to do is we want to learn to recognize when mistakes are likely and really just try harder to avoid significant mistakes when the stakes are going to be higher. And so we're thinking about this, and we're going to get into this idea. We've got our data here, we've collected, we get to our intervention review meeting, we ask the question, is this intervention effective? Do we need to make a change? We got 3 points above, 3 points below, and we want to know what's the right answer. And I think what's the right answer is the wrong question. Because our job isn't to be right, it's to figure out the odds and play it well. We want to use data to make a good decision because there really is no right or wrong decision. We want to be deliberate, we want to use data, we want to make sure we're making a decision that has high odds of being successful, but it's never going to guarantee success. Nothing's 100% with kids. Just like I think about the analogy with this is that we think about things like the weather report. We see the weather report and sometimes the weatherman is wrong. And if you live in Oregon, they're wrong a lot because it's just difficult to predict. That doesn't mean me just going outside and using my intuition and thinking about what the weather is going to be like is going to be any better. They use all the data in the world, and they're still going to be wrong sometimes, but they're a lot better than us as individuals trying to predict the weather on our own. And plus, it's this idea of hindsight bias. You're never going to know if you made the right decision because you can't go back. Like, if we implement an intervention for 10 weeks, it doesn't work. We can't go back 10 weeks and say, let's try something else and compare and see if that worked better. This isn't, I use the analogy of, if you grew up in the 80s like me, you read the Choose Your Own Adventure books. And if you read them like me, you read them and then you ended with an untimely death or something you didn't want. So you just went back to the last decision and changed it. Like, we don't get to do that with our kids. And oftentimes it's only in hindsight that we see that our decisions were right or wrong or good or bad. And so we want to make better decisions up front using data and evidence to guide that. And so we want to think about then the idea is, how do we move our brains from being more intuitive, going with the first thing that jumps in our brain, to how do we be more deliberate with our decision making? So as we kind of switch here, and Brad's gonna take over here and jump into this, while he's doing that, I want you to just pause and reflect. And in the chat, I want you to share out something that resonated with you so far. And then Brad will take it from here.
Here we go. Let's see what's in the chat. Hindsight bias. So true. People feel that they have a chest.
Yeah. A little bit of knowledge is very dangerous.
Yeah.
Yeah, implementation. That's a big one. I mean, implementation is everything.
Teacher predictions. Database decision implementation is important.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you. You're welcome to continue to drop ideas in there. So the next thing we want to talk about in this next section is how we work as a team. And I'm going to use the word team a lot. in this next section. How do we as a team move from intuition to deliberation? John and I would just love to say, just take more time, but it's not just the case. It's just not taking more time in your decision making that's going to make us better decision makers. So we have kind of like three big ideas or things that we want to talk about today that's going to help us move from intuition to deliberation. First is we want to use data and evidence guided by quality decision rules in our decision making. So our tools and our evidence need to be in place for us to move from intuition to deliberation. The next thing is about time. Is how are we scheduling our time together in order to prioritize data-based decision making as a team, using that evidence guided by decision rules as a team, putting ourselves in the right situation to make the best decisions. And then last thing we want to talk about today is how are we training and supporting our teams in order to gain the skills and knowledge to use that data collaboratively to make those decisions together. So the first thing we want to talk about today, and this is the biggest one, I think, is gathering the right amount of data and evidence, the right amount of data guided by our decision rules in our decision making. John kind of touched on this, that decision makers aren't in the business of being right. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to increase, though, our probability that we're going to achieve the outcomes that we want. So when we're sitting at a table making decisions, it's not about the right or wrong decisions. It's about the best decision we have with the information at this time. And in using these other things will help us slow down and move from intuition to deliberation, increasing our odds that we're going to get the outcomes that we want. Some notes about progress monitoring data. Progress monitoring data is the evidence of our impact. It's important in our system and it drives what we do. It increases student outcomes. And the research demonstrates that the formative assessment practices used in progress monitoring helps drive instruction, helps providing the students what they need when they need it, and also demonstrate it increases student outcomes when we're looking at progress monitoring data. But it's how we're looking at that data that's really kind of telltale. And so how do we do that? Well, one of the ways that we look at data and look at our evidence is with decision rules. And decision rules are guidelines, and they're not hard and fast rules. Sometimes I kind of equate them to like the banks of the river, and we're traveling along the river on our journey. Sometimes we're going to paddle right down the middle of that river, and we're going to use the banks as these guidelines. Other times we're going to have to get outside those guidelines and leave the river and still guide ourselves along it, but not be so dictated by those rules and those banks. Research says that it's insufficient and hard fast about the number of data points needed to make the right decision. So how can we increase the number of data points that we have, plus guided by our decision rules to improve our decision making? So we're going to be in situations working in teams like this. And so I would like you to drop in the chat here just a second. We're meeting in our tier 2 review processes. We're meeting as a team, and we're trying to determine if our interventions are effective or not. We use a process called intervention review. So we're sitting at an intervention review meeting as a team, and we're looking at student progress monitoring data for this student. And we have to, as a team, decide, is this effective for this student? And so in this situation, we probably have high confidence that this intervention is working as a team. We can see that there's plenty of data points above that aim line, above that goal line, and we can see that they're making progress here. What about this situation? As a team, what's our confidence that this intervention is working or not working? I would say this, as a team, we could probably have a high confidence that this intervention is not working for this student, okay? Those are pretty easy to determine as a team. Like we have pretty high confidence this one's not working. The previous one, pretty high confidence that intervention was working. But oftentimes we're in situations where we see data like this. And this is really where intuition can lead to some problems, and we have to slow down and be deliberate about this decision making because it's not as clear as those previous two examples. So how in situations like this do we slow down, move from intuition to deliberation? So is this intervention working? It's hard to tell at this point. So decision rules, once again, thinking is still required when we use our decision rules. And they're, like I said before, guidelines that cause us to, or make us pause, analyze, and then respond. We're not completely abandon decision rules and rely on professional judgment, intuition alone. That's not what we do. And here's a situation. This is a graphic that we use to kind of demonstrates this. This is a real life situation that happened to an Uber driver that was following the data explicitly without stepping back and go, wait a minute, I need to slow down and see how my, what kind of data my decisions are so sorry, what my data is telling me, and if I'm making the right decision or not at this time. This Uber driver went down the set of stairs because the data, the information they were receiving says, turn left here. They went down the steps anyways. We don't want to make mistakes like this. So we need to pause and reflect at this point and just ask ourselves this question. Does your school use decision rules to guide decision-making about interventions? And what are they? And if you don't know the answer to this, who can I ask to find this information? So take a minute to pause and reflect. So recent research has come out about improving our decision making in our decision rules, and we're going to share some of that guidance with you today. One of the specific ones is A here, that educators need to use the median or trend line rule as opposed to the data point rule, which we often see. So we're going to really take a look at that. But what we've done is just kind of like simplified. These are some 3 big things that you can do in order to prove our decision rules and our decision making around this. So the big nuggets are this, the big takeaways on improving decision-making decision rules is number 1, use high quality decision rules. That's number 1. Number 2 is use high quality progress monitoring assessments. And we'll talk about what a high quality progress monitoring assessment might look like. And then also collecting enough data. So if we're doing these 3 things, it's going to help on our decision-making for our students. Oops. Here we go. Using high quality decision rules. When do we determine our interventions are working or not working? So oftentimes in the past, we've come across situations where we use the data point rule. And this rule often looks like this. When the last 4 or 5 consecutive data points are below the goal line. So in that situation with that decision rule, we would probably say in this situation with that data point rule that we might continue this intervention, okay? The research is finding that this decision rule is not high quality compared to the other 2 of using the median or the trend line or the median rule, okay? So when we see it on the trend line rule, we see that the growth is less steep than using the data point line. And this student is not on target to meeting goals by the end of the year. So we'd probably want to make a change at this point. Also, when we see the median rule, when the median of at least 3 data points is below the goal line, when we draw that trend line, we can see that we are going to want to make a change as well, because they were not going to be on target to meeting their goals at the end of the year. So the big lesson is use the median or trend line rule as opposed to the data point rule.
I'm curious here, Brad, maybe just pause real quick. If folks know which one of those 3 you're using, you want to drop it in the chat?
Yeah, please let us know what you're using. We're curious about that because I know that I think we used in the past data point rules.
Trend line.
Trend line.
And trend line's good if you have a program that does that for you, median rule, yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's really nice with new systems that do trend line reports and stuff that are a lot easier to read. Median.
Yeah, and I think in general, the trend line rule, I think in general what we've used is the data point rule in the past because it's easy just to look at an eyeball 4 or 5 above. But what we found with research is that's not going to give you your best decision. So going with the trend line or median rule is going to be a lot more effective.
Yeah, I sure appreciate this data and this research that's come out on this though. It's really helps us change our practice. Excellent, thank you. Okay, The next thing that we can help improving our decision-making is purchasing or investing in high quality progress monitoring assessments. So we know that there's a lot of commercially available ones out there. Not all assessment tools are made the same. We're not necessarily in the business to recommend one over the other. We do recommend tools that you can look at to evaluate your systems. So oftentimes you also see and hear about situations where people are making their own assessment systems, and those are not dependable or reliable. So we highly encourage you look at a commercially available one that is of high quality. Also, next, we just want to make sure that we have these different components within your system. You have a system that provides screening data. It has a way to progress monitor your students. And also you're building within your assessment system a way to diagnose your students as well. We would really highly encourage a robust assessment system in order to improve your decision making. Also, we want to make sure that our tools are reliable and valid, and there's ways and look at like NCII's tool ratings and that kind of stuff to help us determine if our assessment tools are valid and reliable. I just came across a situation the other day through this review process where 61% accuracy was the reliability of this tool, and I was like, that doesn't seem very reliable to me, when only 61% of the time we're being accurate with screening. And so just really look at your tools. What is the reliability and the validity behind them? Sometimes we don't, it's screened, we don't know that information. So digging for that information is really important. Next, is this tool tested on your population of students? Is it reflective of your population? I think that's critical for schools and districts to figure out. It's not always easy to determine, but I think it's one of those questions that we need to know. And then finally, are we supporting the fluency of practice with fidelity checks? And are we training it and supporting it how to use these tools appropriately and with fidelity? Next, the big idea about how to improve our decision making is purely by collecting enough data to make the right decision. And recently, more and more research has come out about the number of data points that we need in order to make these type of decisions. A couple of the big lessons, takeaways are here. For a minimum of 5 to 6 data points weeks with multiple data points per week for routine educational decisions. Here's a big one. When we think about our SPED eligibility decisions, we would like 12 weeks of data with multiple data points in those decisions. Here's some other things about more data points and just time and intervention. So we know that it takes some time for interventions to really take place and to work. And so we want to make sure that our students are in interventions long enough. So at least 12 to 14 weeks of intervention. And also 8 or more data points are needed to make these decisions. So let's look at that in a real life example, why collecting more data points is important for us to do. So in this situation, we just progress monitored a student and we got this score of 50 here. Let's say though, they actually scored a little bit lower than that and got a score of 48. It puts them on this trajectory that could put them possibly at the end of the year still in intensive or targeted support region. But if they had improved by just 4 points and you got a trend line that looks like this, they're way above on level. So we have this huge range of potential end results based on the data that we currently have. So in this situation, we're definitely going to want to get more data points to say, are we on track with this intervention? So here's another one. If we're 10 weeks out, we have 10 weeks of data, we have a few more data points. Now let's see where our trend lines put us. We are much more in a smaller range of potential goals by the end of the year when we have enough data points to say, this is the trend line we're on now. So I think it's important that we collect enough data, give it enough time to say, are we on track or not? So this is why more data points, we believe, just helps out. So sometimes students just have bad days versus good days. It's just the fact that sometimes we're ready to do our job, and sometimes we're not. And we need to make sure we have enough data points that accounts for that fluctuation. Also, there's hard passages and easy passages. When we think about the importance of background knowledge in reading, and some students have the knowledge when they access those passages, and some don't. And that changes over time as well. And some are harder and some are easier for students to connect with and access. So it could be related to that as well. So more data points will help flesh that out as well. Also, just engaging by being an interesting and uninteresting passage, because they have that background knowledge and they can connect with it. And also just distractions in the testing environment could possibly also throw off those data points. So just more data points means more confidence in our decision making. How do we get more data points? That's a good question. And it can be limited by time and resource and capacity. So the more intensive needs, though, we want to monitor more frequently. Maybe we can run longer intervention cycles, give more progress monitoring probes in one setting, collect additional data points just prior to your intervention review meeting, and also maybe, and we'll talk about it in just a few minutes, multiple data sources. We also want to have a caveat, though. We don't want to delay some decisions being made. When we think and suspect that a student might have a learning disability, we can't necessarily wait this long in order to make a decision about that. So we just have to be cautious when we make decisions like that. And we have to ensure that we are using our child find responsibilities if we suspect a student that has a special ed need. So this also provides us an opportunity to use multiple data sources within our decision making. So the main source that we use at this level is our progress monitoring data. And it answers that basic question: is the student making significant progress towards proficiency, towards the goals that we have assigned for them? Another thing that we might want to use at this time is our curriculum embedded assessments, because as in teams, we might be sitting and looking and problem solving at our intervention review meetings, and we might notice a graph where a student, we as a team decide they might not be making progress in this intervention. But then we could look at our curriculum embedded assessments and we might see a different thing. And we might ask the question, is the student learning the specific skills I am teaching in this curriculum? And it's just not being reflected in the progress monitoring data. Also, as a kind of data that we might want to have at the table is our student perception data. Do we know, does the student view the intervention as being helpful, or are there unintended consequences of them being in this intervention? I think this is a critical piece that we're missing in decision making, and I would love to see that being implemented more often. Okay. So, is the intervention effective? That's the question. The next area that we want to focus on about how do we move from intuition to deliberation is, as a team, we need to schedule time for database decision-making as a team. So deliberation takes time. We don't always have time, but it does take time. So when time is limited, we do, though, rely on our intuition. And I think it's good that first we acknowledge that and know that we do have a limited amount of time. And then when time is limited, we do operate from intuition. So how do we account for that? So one of the ways that we can account for that is adopting a problem-solving process throughout our tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. We embed within our Oregon ORTIi protocols a problem-solving process. And this quote comes from McIntosh and Goodman from their book, Integrated Multi-Tiered Systems of Support. And it states this: once a standard problem-solving process is defined and adopted, team members can devote more of their energy to solving problems than spending meetings trying to figure out what to do next. It's the same idea as having solid quality instructional routines in your classroom. Students know what to expect. They don't have to guess what's coming next. Very basic. The problem-solving process that we work with our districts on is a 4-step problem-solving process that we have built across our database collaborative support planning. And we have a link here to our teaming document. If you go there, you'll see all the agendas and the purposes of all the teams. And you'll also notice when you get into our agendas, every single one of them is built on this problem-solving process. Number one step is the problem identification. What is the problem? Is our instruction having the expected impact that we want it to? Step two is problem analysis. Why is this happening? Step three, plan development. What are we going to do about this? And then step four is plan evaluation and implementation. Did we implement the plan and is it working? So we encourage you to adopt a problem-solving process. It does not have to be this one. It just has to be some level of a process of people know what to expect when they're coming to do decision-making. The next thing we want to think about is when we're scheduling time to work together to make these decisions. Sometimes this isn't even in our control, but I think it's worth the consideration to really truly give ourselves the space and the grace and put ourselves in the situation to make decisions and quality decisions. So are we meeting before school, or meeting during school, or meeting after? And think about when we ourselves are in the best place mentally to make decisions. We talk a lot about in schools anymore about self-care for adults. And I think this is one of the areas we could truly invest in self-care, is setting ourselves up for success. When are we going to be able to get together and put quality time into a space where we can be the best decision makers we can be? Because we make decisions all day long as teachers. From the moment we almost get up to the moment we go to bed at night, we're always making decisions and planning something out. We get exhausted and we get tired and we have decision fatigue. So how can we take that in consideration? Move from intuition to deliberation by being intentional about when we're having our meetings. Another thing about team, high stakes decisions is a team sport. Make them as a team. So I love this quote that comes from the Checklist Manifesto. Man is fallible, but maybe men are less so. So when we do this as a team, we're going to make better decisions. Oftentimes we hear things from schools that we work with that they're going to see the RTI person. And oftentimes this is left into the hands of one or two individuals. And we highly discourage that practice. And we recommend that you do this and make decisions as a team. So we recommend that active participants at your team meetings starts with this core team. And we encourage this at core review, intervention review, and even more intensive at IPS. But we encourage grade level teachers to be a part of this team. Principals, administrators, literacy specialists, and special education teachers all should be a part of these conversations, these decisions, to ensure continuity across the support spectrum. We also would encourage you to add these individuals, if you have them, instructional support staff, counselors. And more importantly, we have to really consider about when it's the appropriate time to pull our families and caregivers in on the decisions that we're making. When is the right time for that? And I would encourage you not to wait too long, but it's not also up to us when that happens. It's a definitely a contextual thing, but okay. Last section is, in order to move from intuition to deliberation, we want to train and support your teams on data evaluation. So we think about it in these three big areas. When we're designing or thinking about training and supporting teachers, we want to think about training the why. Why are we using the data in decision rules? Why do we do that? How will we collect data and conduct efficient meetings? And then finally, what is universal screening, diagnostic, and progress monitoring? What is it and what does it mean? I think this is a big missing piece in our systems, is the understanding of data and how it's used and how we're going to use it. And it leads to implementation errors or struggles. So I really would focus on this area. Here's an example of data from our tier 1. review process review. This is universal screening data. So just the idea here is we have multiple types of data in our systems that teachers need to understand what they're doing and how to look at it. So this is our universal composite scores, the number of students that are on benchmark or not. Then we have our skill set. These are very familiar to us that are probably here. But the big point is teachers need to understand all the different levels of data and how to use them in their role in it, okay? Down to when we get to our intervention review meetings and our progress monitoring graphs, what does this mean when we look at this? They need to understand all of this, and it takes training and support in order to do that.
Yeah, Brad, and I would just highlight with this one too. This is a kind of a subtle distinction, but we oftentimes look at like the benchmark periods, and we look at where students are at. And so with this student, you know, notice like first benchmark, they were well below benchmark. Second benchmark, still well below benchmark. If you're just looking at the categories, that student looks like they're making no growth, like they're still in the well below benchmark. But if you look at the progress monitoring data and dig a little bit deeper, they're on track to meet that goal to be above the benchmark by the end of the year. So teachers need to understand how to read data and understand that a little bit more deeper, and not just go on these categorical, you know, oh, this is a benchmark kid, or this is a, you know, a intensive kid. You know, those labels aren't helpful because they're, you know, they attribute, they put attributes on kids that don't exist. I mean, those categories are not about kids. They're about the levels of support that we get. But they're only 3 categories, and there's a lot of performance that goes on within those categories. So we want to be more intentional about sharing data with our teachers.
Absolutely. And as a team, become better decision makers. So we encourage this, like a robust professional development plan that takes into consider all these pieces, the why and the how and the what of our data collection and our data usage. And one of the things that we really encourage too is training our leaders before we train some of our staff members, so they can truly support, there it goes, train leaders first, then the staff, so they can support it and expect it. Oftentimes we just send people in isolation and in silos to get trainings, and we don't consider everybody in our system, what level of training do they need so they can expect it and support it and monitor it in our systems. So this is a good professional development plan that keeps track of a lot of those different pieces that need to be put in place. So we are getting close to the end of our session, but we wanted to leave some time for questions and some final thoughts. So I just want to open up with this space. And John, do you have any final thoughts on this before we open up to some questions?
Yeah, I think it says it here. I think as educators, we're trying to make the right decision for kids, but I do think that's the wrong question. We want to make a good decision that has a high odds, high likelihood of success. I mean, that's why we use evidence-based practices. That's why we use evidence-based assessments. But nothing's going to work 100% with all students, especially as we're designing new things. We're learning. You know, if you had the opportunity to attend, for example, Julie Washington's session just last session, talk about just around dialect and language variation, how much we're learning and how they're developing assessments around that. So we definitely want to get better at what we're doing, and don't let perfect be the enemy of good or great. We can't be perfect, but we can definitely be better than what we're doing right now. So our goal, just like kids' goal, is to get better every day at what we're doing, and do that in a sustainable way. And then just, you know, implementation matters. You know, the best decision that you make is one that has a high likelihood of success, but one that the team is committed to implementing well. Like, you could come up with the best plan, but if the team's not going to do it, like, it doesn't really matter. If it's too hard, takes too much time, you don't have the personnel, that's not a plan that you should go with. You should go with a plan that's going to be implemented well and has a high likelihood of success. And then, yeah, the last point, just building a multi-tiered system, you're effectively moving a whole system from intuition to deliberation. That is a very challenging multi-year task to be deliberate as a team. So that's something that should be recognized.
Yeah. We will stop sharing here in a second and do some questions and answers, but we just wanted to make sure you had these resources that we embedded throughout the presentation. So the last slide has the books that we recommended or pulled some of this information from. So that being said, I will stop share. And if there are any questions.
Just looking through the comments a lot on just decision rules. Yeah, I think the thing about decision rules is we've used those historically in the past as these like highly research-based, evidence-based things that we need to follow to a T. And they're more guidelines. I mean, there's more research coming out about what's good about decision rules, what's not so good. It's hard to predict where kids are going to end up. And so collecting 6 to 8 weeks of data, being able to forecast out, well, I know they're going to be, here at the end of the year is very challenging. But we do have some better ways to do that. Looking at multiple data assessments, we want to make our progress monitoring decision rules better. But again, they're never going to be perfect.
Mm-hmm.
One question that came up that I did want to answer. I know Elise asked. Just let me scroll up and find this one. It was about collecting more data. So any examples of school districts that have collected more data points in a sustainable way, which is a challenge. And so there's a few pieces to that. It's nuanced like everything else, but this is part of the reason why looking at progress monitoring tests, we use short like curriculum-based measures for those because it's a whole lot easier to collect additional data if you're getting short assessments and if you have these really big, long assessments. And also we shouldn't conflate longer tests with more high quality tests. There's definitely some longer tests that are not high quality and just give you a lot of noise and not a whole lot of good instructional information. And so I think if you're collecting, you need to collect more data. I think the recommendations we gave is one way, but also think about like what data are you collecting that you're not using and what can come off the table. Thinking about what we see a lot of times, for example, is kids that are being progress monitored on like 3 or 4 different assessments, some of which they've already met the benchmark on multiple times. For some reason, we're still monitoring them on that. Like we want to get kids to grade level as quick as possible. And so we want to monitor as close to grade level. And so maybe if we're monitoring at instructional level and grade level, maybe we swap off. It's every other week or once a month with one, 3 times a month with the other. But we want to be careful about what we're actually collecting and making sure we're using it. So it's more about what comes off the table than what you add to that.
Perfect.
Other questions I'm looking at.
So here's one. When do you recommend progress monitoring off grade level? It's kind of a similar topic.
Yeah, that's a loaded question. That's a big question. I think you want to see progress for a student, and if the student's not making any progress at grade level, you want to kind of you can do what's known as a survey level assessment where you're testing back until you find that right spot. And I know Acadians has a built-in survey level assessment that they offer. And there's guidelines out there for how to do that, but you want to find where they can make some progress of where you're teaching instructionally. I would honestly advocate always checking in, obviously at least 3 times a year at grade level, if not more, because you do run the risk of if you're always monitoring off grade level, you may say, look, they may look like they're making really good progress, but they're making progress towards a lower grade level standard and you're setting them on track to never catch up to grade level. So we need to accelerate kids and not slow walk kids through instruction. So yeah, and to be honest, a lot of progress monitoring measures have some sort of guidance for theirs on when to progress monitoring off grade level. That's a tough question.
Yeah, totally. Next one. When we have 6-week cycles, how often should I formally progress monitor the students? I have only had time for every 6 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I would say at least weekly, if not more. And that may be a case where right before you meet, you may want to collect a few more data points. And so if you're screening, a lot of the screening measures like an order rating fluency, at the screening times, you give 3 passages and you take the median passage. You could do something similar at the bench, or when you get to that 6 weeks, give 3 passages at that last time and take the median, because that's going to give you a pretty stable representation of where the student is currently at. And that kind of addresses the question before that, how many data points at the target before we can safely stop using that measure? To be honest, I would say 2. If they get 2 above that measure, I feel pretty good about bumping them up to the next one, 2 at the target, at the goal of that measure. Because again, as you think about it, at the benchmark, we give 3 passages and we take the median. And if the median's at the benchmark, we say they're good, they're at the benchmark. So because it's the median, that means they have the median and 1 above that. They have at least 2 passages above the benchmark. So 2 passages would be pretty stable.
Yeah. Here's a question. How many data points are, at the target before we can safely stop using that measure?
Yeah, that's the one I just answered.
Okay.
Yeah, there's this one. I've read younger students should be in shorter data cycles, 6 to 8 weeks, and older 10 to 12. What are your thoughts? Yeah, I mean, it's more about having really enough data to make that decision. As we showed the 6-week graph there, 6 weeks, the last data point, if they do 2 points less or 2 points better, it really gives you a whole lot of play in terms of where they're going to be. So you want to have some stable representation. The one thing I would say, we talk about 6 to 8 week cycles or 10 to 12 week cycles. We wait until that time to really make big decisions around changing, like moving to a different intervention or making these wholesale changes. But you should be changing instructional delivery like daily, if not minutely. Don't wait till 10 to 12 weeks to say, well, this kid needs more opportunities to respond, or this kid needs more feedback. Like, those are things that should happen pretty frequently. We actually, I've shared with a few districts now, we actually have districts that have created documents to say, here's the changes that we wait until the 10 to 12 week or 6 to 8 week cycle to make as a team, versus here's a list of the modifications that we would expect you would make all along the way. Like, again, I'm not going to wait 10 to 12 weeks to say, let's give more corrective feedback or more turns to that kid, or even some behavior things. Like maybe we put in some behavior supports for a student, some informal things. I don't want to wait 10 to 12 weeks to do that. I want to do that as soon as the student needs it.